I'm joined now by Adam Klasfeld from All Rise News. Adam, we have a rare glimmer of what looks like good news out of the U.S. Supreme Court in this surprise decision here. Can you explain what just happened?
The Supreme Court allowed Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook to stay in her position pending arguments in that case in January. That's a rare time, just as you said, Brian, one of the rare times that the Roberts Court didn't give Trump exactly what he wanted on the emergency docket because he has been itching to yank Lisa Cook off the Federal Reserve Board of Governors so that he could get his hands on the central economy and dictate, essentially get his majority to follow his cues when he wants the interest rates to be lowered, whether or not that's good for the country, but whether it's good for his politics.
Now, I'm going to kind of almost reverse myself and ask you, is the fact that the Supreme Court didn't give full deference to Trump in this instance, but that they're going to hear this case in its entirety in January, does this suggest anything? Does this maybe give some indication of how they might rule in the future?
It's hard to say because they didn't actually reject Trump's request to stay a lower court's ruling that would have allowed him to remove her from the board. And as a matter of fact, the Supreme Court previously indicated the Federal Reserve was a red line. There have been a number of cases where the Supreme Court, where the Roberts Court, on a series of 6-3 shadow docket rulings, let Trump fire people from the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Federal Trade Commission, and all of these independent agencies. As a matter of fact, in a recent ruling, the Supreme Court questioned whether a judge could do anything to prevent an employee from the government anywhere from being removed at will by the president. But the Federal Reserve was supposed to be a red line because when they were doing this in a decision involving the National Labor Relations Board, they were warned. The Roberts Court was warned, you do this and the Federal Reserve is next. And they responded in their decision with this quote, "We disagree." So we'll see. They have said the Federal Reserve is different because of its importance to the U.S. economy. But they have indicated things before, and when push comes to shove, and when the Trump administration urges it, they have generally, this term, given Trump exactly what he wanted.
Just as a quick aside, kind of in talking about the Lisa Cook situation specifically, what could it mean if the Supreme Court had ruled the other way and allowed Donald Trump, given him full deference, allowed him to remove Lisa Cook or any Federal Reserve governor and kind of, as you had mentioned before, usurped control of the monetary policy in the United States?
Well, it would have seemed to have augured the end of independence of the U.S. economy over a key agency that has control of the U.S. economy. It would have put it under the thumb of the president. And it probably would have sounded the death knell of independent agencies because every time this issue has come to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket, usually in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court says, okay, Mr. Trump, pull whoever you want off whatever board that was designed to be independent. The Supreme Court has signaled that they are considering and are almost certain to overrule a 1935 precedent, Humphrey's executor, that created the independence of the Federal Trade Commission. The same Supreme Court's precedent that created essentially independent agencies going forward that had been, and that they are reconsidering not only that precedent and granted a stay, which in order to do that, they need to suggest that he is likely to prevail on the merits. And they not only allowed him to remove an FTC commissioner, they asked the question of whether a judge can grant any sort of relief in law or equity that would interfere with the president's power to remove people from office. So had they gone the other way, had they not let Lisa Cook stay in this role, it would have been, it could have spelled doom for independent agencies writ large and for an independent Federal Reserve in particular.
And yet, at the same time, we are seeing the Trump administration chip away where they can. For example, they still haven't released the latest inflation data. Because we're in a shutdown right now, the White House has indicated that they won't be releasing the jobs report, which would normally happen on Friday of this week. And so, even if the Fed is able to preserve some independence, we are seeing ways in which the White House continues to try and encroach wherever they can and kind of basically test the fence to see where it's weakest on every single corner of this thing.
Absolutely. And that's why there's been so much criticism and so much outcry about the Supreme Court giving the Trump administration whatever it wants on the emergency docket without explanation, without a word of oral arguments and full briefing on serious questions about how he can purge the government, because we want to be able to trust numbers in a job report. We want to be able to have independence over the economy, that it's decisions that affect our financial health or our public health are not made by the shifting political winds. And the Supreme Court has gotten intense criticism for allowing Trump to do this without even a word of argument. I wonder if that pressure, if the outcry, not only from the public, by the way, but from federal judges who are saying, you're telling us, lower court judges, to follow Supreme Court precedents, and you are not explaining any of your emergency docket orders that are just handing Trump victories left and right without explanation. This may be just Chief Justice Roberts saying, oh, okay, guys, this one will kick off to, we're deferring it, we'll kick it off to January. But one can read this as a concession to public pressure.
Is it just John Roberts though who decides this, or are all the Supreme Court justices coming together in the emergency docket and making these decisions in the same way that they would make any ruling? And I ask that because this is a Supreme Court that is not particularly interested in being responsive to public pressure. This is a court that is wholly and completely basically owned by the Trump administration. We see virtually every case decided on party lines on a 6-3 basis, very often in stark defiance of stare decisis, of precedent, the same precedent that all of these people promised to follow to the ends of the earth when they were doing their confirmation hearings. But going back to that question, is it all of the judges who are involved in these decisions, or is it just some small number of them?
This went to the panel. I'm going to read the decision in its entirety. It just says the application for stay presented to the Chief Justice and by him referred to the court is deferred pending oral argument in January 2026. And they direct the clerk to establish a briefing schedule and everything like that. So we know that this went to the panel and that they kicked the can down the road. They put it off. So we don't know what went into the decision. We don't know if the Supreme Court is essentially hearing the federal judges saying, you're deciding everything on the emergency docket, that there has been case after case where they're handing victories to the Trump administration without any sort of explanation whatsoever, or if this is because they said earlier that the Federal Reserve is a red line for them, and there's some disagreement in the panel. We'll see, but this is something. To your point, Brian, you mentioned the whole precedent, the ignoring precedent, and the Humphreys executor example with the FTC. It's hard to think of a clearer example for that, because Humphreys executor is still law of the land, and that still protects the FTC and protects the FTC commissioner from political interference, and they haven't overruled it yet. But before they overruled it, they let Trump remove an FTC commissioner. It's an astonishing thing, and the fact that they did not go so far this time is a reprieve, and one that we cannot tell, because again, it's an unexplained decision, but one that worked out in favor of an independent government entity.
And so how much how much focus are you putting on what happens when they actually hear this case on the merits? Because I guess this could show once and for all the extent to which this court is going to give full deference to Trump, because when they hear this case on the merits, they can either back up the decision that we saw today, which is that Lisa Cook can remain in her position, and that Donald Trump does not have the authority to fire a Federal Reserve governor, or when they hear this thing on the merits, they can say, you know what? Yes, we stayed this thing on the emergency docket, but now that we've heard this case on the merits, we are going to defer to Donald Trump and basically continue to allow him to chip away at the independence of these independent agencies.
Yeah, but we'll find out where they actually stand now, because we've been just getting these unexplained rulings. The emergency docket where Trump asks, hey, let me do this. Let me remove the FTC commissioner. Let me remove this Merit System Protections Board member. Let me remove this person. And they say yes. And in this one case, they say no. When you have oral arguments, you have people on the record. When you have a ruling, you have reasoning. So it'd be nice to know where the Supreme Court stands. As a matter of fact, you have so many lower court judges who are frustrated because you have them being lectured by some of the conservative justices, like Gorsuch, saying that you are not free to defy our orders. And the response from the federal judges, who are facing intense pressure, including threats and harassment, are saying, we don't know what you're ruling. You're asking us to obey an order that you haven't explained.
Yeah.
So one of the good things about the term beginning, the oral arguments beginning, is that the Roberts Court is going to have to speak in something other than unexplained emergency docket orders that actually will reveal where they stand.
Has there been any explanation of that? Have we heard anything from the court in response to these federal judges who are being asked to uphold rulings that they themselves are given no explanations about? Has the court come out, the Supreme Court come out and said something?
You've had justices here and there trying to defend the practice. They say the argument by
defend the practice of lower court judges having to uphold rulings that there is for which there is no explanation because it's all done on the shadow docket.
Absolutely. I mean, what they say is it's not the emergency docket, it's not the shadow docket. It is the interim docket. We're making an interim ruling that we don't want to be bound by, so we don't want to put too much of our cards on the table before we have the full briefing. That's the theory. But in practice, the emergency docket, the interim docket, the shadow docket, whatever you call it, was supposed to be a place where the most pressing issues of the day aren't supposed to be decided, where nearly century-old precedents aren't supposed to be overturned. Now, it makes sense if you haven't fully gotten to an issue. Yes, maybe you don't have a full ruling. If you're going to effectively overturn a nearly century-old super precedent, it would be nice to have a word of explanation. And that's what's different. And that's why federal judges are coming out in droves saying that your failure to explain what you're doing is having very real consequences. There was an extraordinary story in NBC News. I've interviewed a handful of federal judges in my career. I've been a legal journalist for nearly 2 decades, and I've interviewed a fair number of federal judges. It's very hard to land an interview with federal judges. NBC News interviewed I think a dozen, at least 10 federal judges who were warning that this practice of these shadow docket rulings is putting them in danger because it's sending this message that they're doing something wrong without explaining exactly what they're doing at a time when federal judges are getting threats when they rule against, particularly against the Trump administration. They are getting pizza doxings, which means people are delivering pizzas to their houses, often in the name of the murdered son of a federal judge, to convey the message, we know where you live, and that message is a death threat. A lot of these cases, I haven't seen any of them being prosecuted, so they're under intense pressure. And an extraordinary story in NBC News had them speaking out anonymously because, again, federal judges generally don't talk about this stuff. But it's this extraordinary thing that the Supreme Court keeps overruling them without explanation, now we're going to have to hear some explanations. When there's oral arguments, where there's real rulings on the merits, there's going to have to be a real reckoning on this.
Yeah.
And I think that this particular decision, the one line in the sand that the Roberts Court has drawn, allowing an agency that even they said was designed to be independent, not to have the moment that Trump says she's out, you're fired, that say, hold up, we're going to have arguments on this in January. That's a silver lining on what has otherwise been a very, very bleak series of emergency docket orders.
Well, look, as we've said, this is not the last that we're going to hear about this. When they hear this case on the merits in this next Supreme Court term, we'll have a little bit more transparency into what the actual decision is going to be. But at least a momentary reprieve here for those who are watching. If you'd like to support Adam's work, he is an independent journalist. All Rise News is an amazing outlet that I use on a daily basis, so I'm going to put that link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. If you'd like to support him, if you'd like to support independent media more broadly, please do yourself a favor and go ahead and sign up for All Rise News. Again, that link is on the screen and in the post description. Thanks so much, Adam, for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Brian. Always a pleasure.